Hi, I'm Tim Paradis, Insider Senior Editor for the Future of Business. I'm delighted to have my colleague, Catherine Boudreau, Insider Senior Sustainability Reporter, here to talk about her recent experience covering the United Nations Climate Summit known as COP27. It just wrapped up over the weekend after 2 long weeks. We'd love for you to join the conversation by submitting questions through the Q&A web widget at the bottom of your Zoom and on social media using the hashtags Insider Events and Sustainable Future. So, Catherine, welcome back to the US. You were in
Thanks.
Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, covering the climate summit, formerly known as the Conference of the Parties, or COP for short. And like I said, this year's meeting was called COP27. I wanted to talk a little bit about your impressions from being at this seaside resort city with 30,000 other attendees. But first, we should probably talk about one of the big takeaways, which was loss and damage, maybe perhaps even the biggest takeaway. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was my first time attending COP in Sharm el-Sheikh this year. And I arrived knowing that loss and damage was going to be the biggest issue, but very, very uncertain whether it would yield any major outcomes. And we got a huge, I think, surprise. It was like down to a nail-biting few hours where climate diplomats were haggling over how to set up a fund and even whether to establish one. So basically what loss and damage is developing nations are calling on rich countries to pay into a fund for the damages that have already been suffered in countries that are the most vulnerable to the climate impact. So there's this coalition called the G77 plus China. And that's a big coalition of developing nations, and they kind of work together as a bloc in talks with the wealthier countries like the US or those in Europe. So they just were, this was their main demand heading into COP27. And it was really like decades in the making because, talks of a loss and damage fund, like what happened in Pakistan, for instance, earlier this year, where there was, nearly 2,000 killed and estimated $30 billion in damages. For 30 years, countries like Pakistan have been saying, hey, rich nations, you are the most responsible for the pollution entering the atmosphere. We aren't. And we're the most vulnerable. So you should be compensating us for that to help us respond to disasters. So that was like loss and damage was certainly the litmus test. I think we heard that from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the very beginning. We heard it from all of the main, the world leaders from like Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago and Barbuda, for example, all of them, and Pakistan too, they were all calling for this new fund. Historically, the US and Europe had resisted its creation, mainly because I think they were worried about being on the hook for what could be like trillions of dollars in damages. And they decided to switch their position, like the Biden administration heading into COP27 said, okay, we're going to support it being on the actual official agenda. Like right at the beginning of COP27, that was agreed to. And that was even a milestone because previously it had never even made on the official agenda, which meant there had to be some sort of outcome. And then fast forward 2 weeks, and the countries agreed to set up a fund, but then over the next year or so, all the like nitty-gritty details of what that actually means will be worked on. So, who pays and how much and how does it get distributed? That's going to be the real challenge ahead. I think one major sticking point to look out for is with China. So the US Climate Envoy, John Kerry, he wants China to pay into this fund. And, China is the top polluter now, but under the definitions of global institutions, it's still a developing country. So it doesn't have a responsibility to pay climate finance, but it is the world's largest polluter now. Historically, no, the US and countries in Europe are, but that's a tension to watch as these talks unfold.
Yeah, it's really going to be interesting because it sounds almost like that the easy part was setting up, getting it on the agenda was certainly a milestone, like you said, and setting up this fund, or at least the idea of the fund is there, but how are you going to get countries to pay for it, particularly at a time when they're facing their own budget shortfalls, I guess a perennial challenge. But how do you have any sense from talking to delegates there, how likely it is that we'll get substantial funding, or do you think this will be kind of a window dressing thing where we get a small fund, but that's woefully insufficient?
It's a great question. And I think there's other trends that have played out that might speak to this. So, there is this fund, another fund, it's for adaptation and mitigation. So this is called the Green Climate Fund, and it's separate from what will be the Loss and Damage Fund. And like a decade ago, rich nations said, by 2020, we're going to put up $100 billion a year so that developing nations can adapt to climate change. Because, there's already effects baked in. So, they need more resilient infrastructure, like to withstand increasing storms, or, they also need help to transition to more renewable energy. Because right now, maybe their economies are based on fossil fuels, and, to invest in renewable energy will cost a lot of money. So that's what the Adaptation and Mitigation Fund is for. And rich nations still have not fulfilled that commitment to cough up $100 billion annually. So they might be doing that by 2023, but still that's 3 years late. So is viewed as a broken promise, by developing nations, and it certainly erodes trust. So I think it is, to be determined. We'll see if, rich countries actually fulfill this loss and damage pledge.
For sure. It's really going to be interesting. I think I'd read somewhere that the loss and damage has kind of been on the wish list for about 30 years. So It's taken this long just to get the delegates to actually talk about it officially and then put wording to it.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder a little bit about Pakistan being a champion for that. And you touched on the flooding they had over the summer, which was horrendous, and a third of the country underwater. Do you feel like that there was any kind of, I guess, like moral momentum they had on their side, saying, look, that you just really can't ignore this anymore? I mean, what happened there was so extreme and so devastating. Do you feel like there was any kind of power that helped them get this through?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The flooding that happened in Pakistan is just, that became the poster child of this COP, I think. And the fact that, that combined with the fact that it was held in Africa this year, and Africa is the most vulnerable continent to climate change. They have only contributed 3% of global emissions, where that's just such a tiny amount, yet they're the most vulnerable. So I think, the flooding that happened in Pakistan, the fact that COP27 was in Africa, in Egypt, I think that really fueled this momentum for sure. And there's all of these pavilions that countries have inside what I would describe as these huge warehouses on the COP campus. And inside them are just, filled with countries' pavilions where they promote what they're doing to address the climate crisis and, invest in nature-based solutions. And Pakistan's was always flooded with people. I went, and it said, its slogan was what happens in Pakistan will not stay in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And I think that message really resonated because global warming, there might be floods in Pakistan, but these events are going to play out all over the world with increasing intensity. So certainly Pakistan they were also the chair this year. It was just a coincidence, I think, but they're the chair of the G77 plus China, that coalition of developing nations. So they really held the mantle for sure.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. It'll be very important, I think, to watch in the next year to see how these funds come together and to see what kind of buy-in we get from the wealthy nations that I think are going to maybe have trouble committing to something that's too much. I know there were some commitments out of Europe this time, but it's interesting too that the different language around loss and damage being kind of the I guess the jargon of COP, but then also some climate activists talking about reparations, which is a sort of a loaded term in this country. And yes. So it's an interesting talking about climate reparations in that case, but it's an interesting I guess dance that happens with even the sort of nomenclature around this, just to sort of get buy-in.
Yeah, I mean, I heard from other journalists that the White House was not happy that climate reparations had become kind of just synonymous with loss and damage. So it is politically sensitive. And I will say too that, it's not just the president of the United States gets to decide how much we're going to put into climate finance for developing nations. He has to get sign off from Congress. So I think that's been a huge obstacle. I think only $1 billion last year was allocated to climate finance in the US because that's what Congress signed off on. And now that after the results of the midterms, I think it's going to be even harder to get the money that the US has promised. President Biden has promised to quadruple climate finance compared to the level seen under the Obama administration. But again, like he can say that, but he can't do it alone.
Right. No, yeah, and as you said, the political calculus in this country has just changed. I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about the planet's temperature, I guess you could call it. And there was a lot of discussion around the 1.5 degree Celsius target that scientists have said we need to adhere to in order to not completely go off the rails as a planet. And there was, I guess, a disappointment of this COP. It seems like that there wasn't more done on this. At the start of the COP, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, we're in the fight of our lives and we're losing. And he also said, we're on the highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. So he was trying to set a tone of urgency there. Do you think that what came out of this COP kind of matched that tone in terms of the 1.5 degree Celsius?
No, just honestly, no. Basically, world leaders entered Sharm el-Sheikh with temperatures being on track to rise by at least 2.4 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. So that's way off the 1.5 goal. And that 1.5 threshold is included in the Paris Agreement because that's what climate scientists say would avert like the most catastrophic effects of climate change. So what happened at COP, I think, it didn't really move the needle compared to last year's climate summit in Glasgow. There weren't a lot of more ambitious pledges. I think some that stick out was like Mexico and Egypt. They did set more aggressive goals by 2030. And then Turkey did as well. But I read a Bloomberg report also that they did some kind of fancy math, and basically their new plan would actually allow them to more than double the carbon dioxide emissions they're putting into the atmosphere compared with 2020 levels. So not exactly headed in the right direction, not exactly aligned with that 1.5 degree target. Right. And I think there was this push by India, for example, to make sure that the deal that came out of COP talked about phasing down fossil fuels. So that would be coal, oil, gas. And that would be a big step in the right direction compared to last year's COP in Glasgow, where they just specifically mentioned unabated coal. So coal that is not paired with carbon capture technology to control emissions. But that effort stalled. And I think a big blockade was the major oil producers like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Their leaders were at COP27 talking about how they're going to supply the world with oil as long as they need to, while at the same time promoting in their pavilions that all this green technology they're investing in, whether it's wind or solar, hydrogen. So there was definitely a big contradiction there, and there was loads of fossil fuel lobbyists. So in short, no, like there was not much progress on cutting greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming.
And you mentioned the pavilions a couple of times, but these are, you described this to me earlier, this kind of feels like a trade show. Can you talk just a little bit about, I think a couple of, you mentioned UAE and Saudi Arabia, they had pretty large installations. Is that right? Oh,
yeah, absolutely. The United Arab Emirates, I think, had the biggest delegation, and that's because we're in Egypt and close to the Middle East, and they're actually hosting COP28 in Dubai next year. So yeah, and they sent the largest delegation, I think, out of any country.
Wow. So, and then you also mentioned oil and gas, and I think we had a massive presence this year, in particular, it seems, of oil and gas companies. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what you saw there and just maybe what some of the misgivings are among some of the delegates or environmentalists or others?
Yeah, so Global Witness came out with a report during the 2 weeks that found there was like more than 600 delegates at COP27 affiliated with oil and gas. So either they were, fossil fuels in general. So either they were, directly linked to a company, or they were maybe they were on a delegation and linked to the interest. So that was just an enormous increase compared to Glasgow. I think, I don't know the exact figure, but it definitely, maybe even like 25% more fossil fuel representatives there. And their message was basically that natural gas is cleaner than coal. Coal is the most polluting fossil fuel. So, hey, let's get rid of that and substitute it with natural gas or oil because it's cleaner. Like, they're promoting it as a cleaner fuel. But again, that does conflict with the actual science, which is that you can expand fossil fuels and reach that 1.5 degree limit of warming that is enshrined in the Paris Agreement. So this is a contradiction. And I will just say too, I reported a story while I was there just about like the oil and gas deals that were struck. Just at least three during the 2 weeks I was in Egypt, and mainly in Africa, because Europe has been, they really need a lot more energy because Russia has cut off its natural gas supply to the continent. And so they're in Europe, or they're in Africa, officials from Europe are in Africa, saying, hey, like, send us your fuel. And some African leaders are welcoming that because they want to develop their economies. And they're like, who are you to tell us we can't industrialize using fossil fuels, which rich nations have done for like more than a century. So it's just this really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, it seems a bit, I think I read some coverage as well beyond ours as well that just talked about the hypocrisy there of telling everyone how to go around the world and telling them how to develop after you've sort of taken the easier route.
Well, and, the US emissions increased last year because of a boost in oil. So who's the US to like lecture other countries,
We don't really have any room to talk. No, that's a fair point.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I thought was really interesting was, and I want to hear a couple, some of the highlights and lowlights, I guess, but about the funders, the big funders. So the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, there was some progress there, I understand, in terms of maybe getting them to take on some riskier investments, so that might open up some funding for developing countries. Is that right?
Yeah, this was another major theme. Absolutely. So developing nations were talking about how they're just in this cycle of debt. They have to take out loans, often from multilateral development banks like World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, to after a disaster, for example, to like rebuild. They also want to become more resilient to climate change. So it's just this constant cycle of debt. They also have higher interest rates because they're considered a riskier investment than richer nations. So there's just was a lot of calls for reform. And I'm not an expert in, exactly how this financing works, but I heard talks a lot about like concessional finance, which I think just means that, yeah, they will take on a greater amount of risk. Maybe there'll be a greater share of grants rather than loans, so that they don't have to be paid back. And I think the idea is that right now there's obviously there's not enough climate finance flowing around to really meet the challenge of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by, so these financial institutions need to step up. That was like the main call.
That's interesting. So it seems maybe, and we'll talk about, I guess, at the end when I ask for your overall takeaway, but it seems like maybe a mixed report card here. But I did note that there were a few things that looked like they made it into the final COP statement for the first time. Some interesting language around tipping points, things like nature-based solutions, and even a reference to cultural heritage. And I know that's a lot, but is there anything in that list that jumps out at you as far as kind of being noteworthy as a first time something being included at COP?
Well, I think just the reference to you mentioned like cultural heritage was really like significant, especially because we were in Egypt. And after I was done covering the conference, I spent some time in Cairo, and I went to visit the pyramids and the Sphinx and King Tut's all of these antiquities that are this like basically gold found in his tomb. And it's just really humbling, I guess, to be like in the cradle of civilization. Yet, a lot of these sites are at risk, they're at risk of of climate change too. They're going to be degrading over time with more intense heat and drought, and it's difficult to protect them. So I think that really resonated with me, just like being in Egypt and the impact that climate change can have on these like just real, this cultural, the cultural heritage of a country.
Interesting. And then on the not cultural, I'm just repeating you, on the nature-based solutions, John Kerry had a carbon credit program that he unveiled during COP. Can you just talk briefly about that?
Yeah, that was really controversial. So it was kind of, I think, a little bit half-baked. Seemed a little rushed. And basically, pretty early on in the conference, John Kerry announced that they were going to be doing a new carbon offset plan. Basically, these offsets allow polluters, whether it's a company or a country, to pay to offset their pollution by either avoiding emissions or sequestering emissions, like pulling emissions from the atmosphere via like nature-based projects. So protecting a forest or planting trees. There's just a lot of skepticism of carbon markets. Like it's a way to raise private money, because companies, I'm thinking of the ones that were flanked by John Kerry, like Microsoft or Pepsi, there's going to be some emissions that they can't reduce on their own. They're going to buy carbon offsets to reach their net zero goals. So, they like it. But then again, there have been many investigations showing that, the actual carbon savings are pretty dubious. John Kerry acknowledged that. He said, look, we understand that there's like carbon offsets have kind of been discredited, but there's all of these initiatives underway right now to make sure that the scientific integrity is better, that there's more transparency to figure out, which projects are getting funded, and also that they're on a larger scale, because like planting some trees somewhere off in Indonesia, is that really getting the scale that you need to meet the challenge? So, I just think it's interesting that a lot of the funding for nature-based solutions will seemingly go through carbon offsets. And it's just kind of the Wild West right now.
Yeah, the criticism you mentioned, if you're paying to preserve a forest that was in no danger of being, ripped down anyway, then what are you really saving there, right? So then it sort of feels like a license to.
Right. And renewable energy projects. So it's like, are you really going to get credit for investing in renewable energy when that is now the cheapest form of energy? Like that doesn't seem to be.
Right.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, a lot that seemed to happen over 2 weeks. I thought I would ask briefly, and I teased this at the beginning, but just a little bit about what it was like for you as a reporter on the ground for the first time at COP with a bunch of other reporters. I guess I was curious about some of the logistics. I remember you mentioned at one point the electric buses. Can you just talk a little bit about sort of getting around? And then, of course, I have to ask about the food because, man, that got a lot of attention.
Oh, my God. Okay. I would describe being there as a marathon, a very disorienting marathon. I had no idea what to expect. And, excuse me, you can only do like so much preparation because just there's 30,000 people there. And as a reporter, you're like, who's the most important people to talk to? And you try to identify them. I put some pictures on a Google Doc of some of the lead negotiators, and I was like, I'm going to find them and pin them down. But it actually became easier to pin them down because they held random press conferences like throughout the week, especially as negotiations were really getting down to the wire. So that was actually easier than I thought, getting hold of the lead negotiators. But the main challenge was just actually figuring out how to navigate this maze of a climate conference and just the actual site itself. So it's like, I don't know, it took me a solid like 4 days just to figure out how to get to point A to point B. I mean, there was a main media center where everybody was working from. And then from there, like you could walk. I mean, I did like 20,000 steps a day easily, just walking through all the pavilions, which are in these huge giant warehouses. And then you go from one, you leave that one, you go to another one, you leave that one, and you do another tunnel to this other area. It was just a total maze. So yeah, that was the biggest challenge was just finding my way around.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You said shipping crates, right? A lot of it was sort of organized with shipping crates to sort of make walls and things like that, right?
Yeah, it was all very makeshift, like I think the conference center itself, there was, some actual physical buildings that existed for the conference center before COP27 happened, but they had to really like, I would even say like triple the size of it, maybe even more, because yeah, you had to have all these big, huge shipping containers filled with pavilions. So
Well, and it's also, I mean, Sharm el Sheikh is a resort city, so I think it's something like 70,000 people. So that's a pretty big influx of visitors for even a place that's used to having a lot of people come to swim in the Red Sea and do that kind of stuff. Talk to me a little bit about the food and the coffee, because that, like I said, even just following this on Twitter, that seemed to get, get a
yeah.
lot of
Oh my
attention.
God. Okay. So thank God I stayed at a resort, because at least I got like breakfast and dinner. Because once you arrived to the conference center, your food choices were very limited. At first, it was really expensive. And the only thing that I found like the first 2 days, because again, I still was trying to figure out my way around, was like quiche, really random, and croissants. And so legit people were surviving on quiche and croissants for a few days before they actually figured out, like, I did find it through word of mouth, like it was funny, word of mouth would spread, like, where's the best place to find food? So by Wednesday, for example, like 3 days after I arrived, I found out that there was a $20 buffet that was actual real lunch. And so I get there, I'm so happy. And then I had to wait in line to get a ticket. And then as soon as I get up to the ticket counter, they're like, sorry, we're closed. We ran out of food. I'm like, no, I was about to have my first good meal, like at the conference. And then there's all this outrage about the prices. So like the Egyptian government slashed prices in half, and then they made drinks free. Because people were like, we can't find water,
So
we're in
I'm
the
assuming you
desert.
water. And I think you said, what did you say about the coffee? That where was the best spot?
Oh my God. Yeah. There was no good coffee unless you went to the countries known for good coffee, like Colombia. So I found their pavilion. And and then the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the Rockefeller Foundation had a combined pavilion, and they had an espresso machine. So I would go there and get espresso
Nice.
when I
So
needed to pick me up at like 4 o'clock.
it's got like an Epcot feel to it, right? Where you go to the different countries and try to figure out what they're known for. So in this case, go to Colombia for coffee, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that the food issue was definitely, everybody was grumbling about that.
That's funny. So what I also, one thing that one of our producers had talked about too was the sort of I guess the juxtaposition maybe of some of the big sponsors and then what the goals of COP27 are. So Coca-Cola was mentioned as one, right? Major company, but also creates a lot of plastic bottles, a lot of plastic waste. Can you speak at all to just kind of what you saw as like, COP brought to you by XYZ, and then maybe some of the contradictions inherent in that?
Yeah, I would say Coca-Cola was the biggest one. That was like sparked the biggest outrage. Because yes, there's the largest plastic producer in the world. And I don't think the connection between plastic and oil is always made. I mean, plastic is made from oil, and actually oil majors are investing a lot in plastic production because they see this as that next big opportunity for them, especially in like developing countries where they can build, these big that maybe have a little bit like laxer environmental or air regulations. Yeah, they're like putting their money into that, because as countries phase off fossil fuels, maybe not as fast as we want, but eventually, we'll get there. They see that as plastic as an opportunity to actually grow. So I think that was the biggest contradiction that I saw. I will say that like the Coca-Cola bottles were made of glass, which, I mean, the plastic industry say, hey, that's more carbon intensive. But yeah, there was a lot, and an attempt to recycle a lot. Like there was, bins all over the campus for like plastic and cardboard, and none for glass though. That was weird. Like there was no place to recycle my glass. It was very confusing. And then I would just see like big piles of trash. And I really thought to myself, is this all getting recycled? Because we definitely, like in the US, we can't even get a grip on it. So
In the US, as you know, there's not much market for recycled glass. So then that's the whole other,
no,
as you said, the
right.
carbon intensity, because it's so heavy, you got to transport it. So
Yep.
that's funny. So just briefly before I ask for your sort of final COP takeaway, what would you say as far as like just getting around? Like how did you kind of do your job on the ground? How did you get into the various speeches, things like that? Like what was that like?
Yeah. So I'd say I would start my day like getting to the conference center between like, 9 if I had a meeting or there was a press conference I wanted to attend or 10. Because it was long days, sometimes you wouldn't leave until like maybe 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And they did provide Egypt provided free electric shuttles and they came very regularly. So it was easy to get a ride. It took like 40 minutes to get to the actual conference center from my resort. And the resorts it was kind of strange. Like there wasn't a lot of people at the resort. Like I would wake up in the morning and, you'd think you'd see people like lounging out on the beach or by the pool, but no, I think everybody was going to COP. So they were a little bit empty. But yeah, so it took me like 40 minutes to get to the venue, and then you'd go through, scan your badge. I'd kind of park out at the media center, but then I would set up interviews with people and like hopefully find them inside a pavilion. Eventually I just told them to meet me outside the media center, and that was like way easier. And then I would basically like go to pop-up press conferences, or I would cover major speeches by the world leaders from the media center, mostly because I found out that only certain select journalists were able to get into the actual area where President Joe Biden was speaking, for example. So I didn't get a chance to go view him live. And a lot of reporters didn't. There were thousands, like a lot of us in the media center watching the speech. And one of my friends who I met there was Moroccan. She's a journalist and speaks the language. So she actually finagled her way in through security to watch President Biden speak. So I was a little jealous.
It helps.
Yeah, it helps to know the language for sure. So yeah, I would say like that was kind of how I did my job. It was like very day by day, and depending on what the major event was or the major press conferences, I would attend those and just try to schedule meetings in between and find time for writing. But yeah, you would enter in the morning and then you'd leave when it was dark outside.
Well, I'm bummed that you didn't get to spend any time at the pool, but
well, I did go snorkeling. On one day we had a Sunday off, and a group of reporters took a trip up the Sinai Peninsula to Dahab to go snorkeling, and there's a beautiful coral reef there. So I did get to see a coral reef on my day off, which was absolutely beautiful. But it did take a lot of security checkpoints. Like the Sinai Peninsula is very militarized. I mean, Egypt in general, there's just security everywhere. And we didn't actually talk about that, just about the real presence of security and how difficult it was for protests to take place. I mean, Egypt, has suppressed protests. They don't really allow demonstrations. So you could feel that for sure.
Right. And I think you said prior to this, but designated areas for demonstrations, but not sort of free flowing like you would have had last year in Glasgow as an example.
Right. Yeah. I didn't attend Glasgow, but the reporters I spoke to said, thousands of people would be in the streets protesting. It was not like that in Sharm el Sheikh at all. There would be little pop-up protests in the venue, not in the area that was designated for protests, which you had to take a bus to. So it was a bus ride away from where all the action was happening.
Yeah.
And by design, clearly.
Yeah, exactly. Gets no attention. So I guess my last question then would be, what would you say if you sort of thought about big takeaways or the big impact of COP27, maybe what the to-do list is? I don't know, any sort of final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think every time like there's a COP, everybody asks like, does this even matter? But I think it's really all we have as an annual place where world leaders come together to try to do something about climate change. So yes, it does matter. The outcome isn't always as ambitious as people hope for. But I think, even in the Paris Agreement was struck in 2016, the world was on track to warm by like 4 degrees or something. Really like way even more alarming. Of course, a 2.4 degree rise is also really alarming, but better than 4. So like something's happening for the good. And yeah, I think this climate summit will absolutely be known for like a historic win for developing countries. But, again, just the pace of transition to renewable energy just is not fast enough in other climate solutions. And right now, the fossil fuel industry has the wind at its back because there's a global energy crisis. So that was certainly just looming over the whole talks.
It'll be interesting to see what comes up and it makes the news next year in Dubai.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. And thank you to our audience for watching. Make sure to check out Insider Sustainability coverage, where you can read what Catherine has written at businessinsider.com/sustainability. This conversation will be available on YouTube, so feel free to share on your social media networks with the hashtag Insider Events and Sustainable Future. I'm Tim Paradis. Thank you for watching.